Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be doing some card analysis, but instead of looking at current cards, I want to go back and take a look at the cards of yesteryear, see what Bushiroad's B team was cooking up in the past, and how it failed spectacularly. So join me as we take a look at Vanguard's Barely Supported. So today's archetype is going to be one of what I like to call the Fighters Collection archetypes. That is to say, Bushiro needed to give every clan a new G unit, so they looked at one popular card in each clan and said, "You're an archetype now." Let's get into the Infinite archetype. The Infinite archetype is a series of cards primarily from the Link Joker clan and a sub-series of Star Vader. Being from Link Joker, the archetype focuses around locking the opponent's rear guards, in particular both a front and back row. The archetype technically debuted in 2014 with the introduction of Trial Deck 11's Star Vader Invasion, but it wouldn't see its first support until Fighters Collection 2015 Winter in 2016. After that, they received a few more cards of support in GBT08 Absolute Judgment in 2016, before being ultimately forgotten about, like so many other archetypes. Before we get into the actual support, we have to acknowledge these three cards: Titan of the Infinite Trench, Infinite Corrosion Form Death Army Cosmo Lord, and Infinitesimal Star Vader Maron. These three cards are technically part of the archetype by coincidence, but outside of Maron, you can't even play them in the same deck. So, moving in chronological order, we start with the original Infinite unit, which is Star Vader Infinite Zero Dragon. He's a grade 0 with 11k power. IZD was the first break ride for the Link Joker. That is to say, in case you don't know, when you ride over it while you have 4 more damage, your Vanguard with an extra 10k for the turn, and some other additional effect. For IZD, this is locking 2 of your opponent's rear guards, one in the front row and one in the back. Additionally, all break rides were able to gain 2k power by meeting some condition. For IZD, this is simply attacking a Vanguard. Unfortunately, this is Van only, so any IZD rears are stuck at 11k. IZ does also have Lord, but this is a keyword that's been since rendered obsolete. Back in its heyday, IZD was a staple for all Link Joker decks. It offered probably the best way to lock rear guards and comboed well with the powerful Link Joker boss units of the time. Of course, as we moved away from Limit Break as the main strategy, this card would lose relevancy as there were much faster and better strategies to go for. If we want to consider the playability for current day premium, it does technically hit force numbers on its own, although why you would want to attack into a grade 3 Vanguard with this instead of striding is beyond me. The fact that it is a Star Vader gives it access to all the modern day support, but realistically, there are much better boss units to go for since this card serves as simply a support role. 2 years later, we would see the introduction of 2 new cards from Fighters Collection 2015 Winter, officially making IZD its own archetype. We'll start out with Clear Out Star Vader Burium, a grade 1 with 7k power and 5k shield. At the end of your turn, if you have a grade 3 Star Vader Vanguard and your opponent has a locked card, you can retire it to write a card with Infinite in its card name from your deck at rest. So clearly this card was designed with rewriting IZD over IZD and locking 2 rears on board. The biggest snafu with this card is getting a locked card on your opponent's board, but with modern support it's much more feasible. You can pull this off easily by using the Limit Break remover or even self-damagers, as both skills will resolve at the end of turn and you can choose to activate the Limit Break skill before your damage goes back down. It does also technically set you to start up your turn with a break ride before you stride, where you do lose out on the 10k power but you get a locked 2 rear guards. In modern day, this card has a new purpose. The V-Clan collections gave us an IZD with a force marker. This means that you can ride for turn, get a force marker, and then re-ride into V-IZD during the end phase, and generate a second force marker. For one last quick note, this card doesn't specify that you have to ride a grade 3, so technically you can ride down with this skill. However, the only grade 2 is Infinite is Titan of the Infinite Trench, which you can't play unless you're doing Extreme Fight. You can ride into Marin, but you'll be putting yourself back to ground 1, which is not really where you want to be re-riding into. But it is funny to note that if the overdressed naming team ever slips up and accidentally gives us a grade 2 with Infinite in its name, Star Vaders get a half-decent ride down. The other card introduced in Fighters Collection is Death Star Vader Quintessence Dragon. It's a grade 4 G unit with 15k plus power and the on-place ability to counterblast and soul blast 1 when you have an Infinite Heart to lock both a front row and a back row unit. Then, if you have 4 more damage, those cards become Omega Lock. That is to say, they don't unlock during the next end phase. Not a terrible effect, but it's really limited by the need for an Infinite Heart. It probably wasn't worth the effort to go out of the way to play IZD back in the day. I didn't play in that time, but I'm pretty sure Messiah and even Chaos were better choices and didn't play IZD anymore. I'll give this unit credit as it provides an option to go to while you wait for Limit Break to be online. Unfortunately, this card can't be comboed with Limit Break removers or even self-damagers. In the modern day, we have V IZD to sit on, so it's somewhat playable again, but it requires a dedicated deck to use. GBT8 would see the last two cards of support for a while. First off is Starvader Gremlin Dragon, a grade 2 with 9k power and 5k shield. On rearguard, this unit gets 2k power for each locked card in the same column. Additionally, when your grade 3 Infinite Vanguard is placed, you can CB1 and lock an opponent's rearguard in the back row. Okay, so this card is decent if a little outdated. The power gain is nice, and it's in theme since Infinite is all about locking front row and back row. With this card, you would be aiming for an entire column. Funnily enough, the random power game actually puts this card at 13k, which is perfect for force numbers. It does require a bit of setup and good play, but it's kind of just a bonus for playing the deck. The second skill is a little bit more tactical. Unfortunately, it's locked behind a grade 3 being placed, so you can't use it when you stride, which really limits its usability. We can only really use the skill during the ride phase or the end phase if we use Burium. Technically, we could also use it during the battle phase too with the next card we'll look at, but for now, let's just discuss the skill. Link Joker is very much a control deck, and playing it properly requires the player to consider how they use their resources. You'll have to decide if that extra back row lock is beneficial enough to commit the CB to, or whether you want to use it on something more impactful. It is always better to have options than not, so Grimguard is still a half decent card today. And for our last card, we have Starvader Infinite Distarve, a grade 3 with 11k power and 2 abilities. The first is Limit Break 4. When its attack hits a Vanguard, you can bind an IZD rearguard and then immediately ride it as stand. If you do, you get to lock a front row and a back row unit. It's kind of interesting that Bushiroad is still printing Limit Break cards in 2016, and it kind of holds this unit back. Even with Limit Break removers and self-damagers, this skill is still locked behind an on-hit. Not to mention that it requires some setup, with you specifically needing an IZD rearguard. That being said, we do have to give this skill credit for what it is, a second Vanguard swing. Not to mention that unlike most restands, this skill doesn't require you to discard at all. You just call IZD, bind it, you can even swing with it first. Now there is the obvious downside that in order to get the second Vanguard swing, you need to skip the stride step since Link Joker doesn't have a Crystal Luster. Well, actually you can have your cake and eat it too, thanks to this card's second skill. On rearguard, if its attack hits, you can counterblast 2 and discard a card to bind itself face up and ride it as stand. In order to do this, you need an IZD Vanguard, but as long as it's your heart card, you can just ride this over any G unit. With this card as your Vanguard, you have a theoretical re-ride with this unit's Limit Break skill, assuming you have an IZD on board. That being said, the cost to actually do this is incredibly high. CB2 is really steep, and even discarding a card isn't something a control deck really wants to be doing. Of course, the upside is more offensive pressure and 5 to 7 drive checks. Do note that you do need to be able to hit the Vanguard 2 times and be under Limit Break, or else have the remover on board. You'll also need to have Distarve and IZD on the board before going into your battle phase, which has become a bit easier granted with the introduction of Forbidal. The review of the cards ends us exactly with the same card we started with, Infinite Zero Dragon. With the advent of the Overdress format, the V-Series ended with the V-Clan collections. Specifically in Volume 2, we saw the release of Starvader support, including the V-Series IZD. This time, Infinite Zero Dragon is a grade 3 with 13k power and the imaginary gift Force. When it's placed on Vanguard or ridden over, you can counterblast 1 and discard a card to lock one of your opponent's rearguards. If you're at 4 damage, you get to lock a card in the front row and back row instead. So this skill is fine? It does seem a bit overcosted, and I think you probably have better things to spend your CB on. The discard is also a little rough. I feel if you're ever going to use this, you want to wait until you're at 4 damage to get the most value. It is nice that it's an on-play skill, so you can use a skill and still stride. It's a bit unfortunate that it's not really a proactive skill and relies on the opponent to put out a board, so the chances are you won't always be able to use the skill. The second skill is active on both rear and van, where it gets an extra 5k for each of your opponent's locked card. This skill is just a nice bonus. It makes any extra copies into decent beat sticks. If you're going for that triple Vanguard attack, you do need an IZD rearguard, so it's nice that it can be more than just an 11k vanilla. With that being said, I think an Infinite deck is probably going to max out on this IZD. You do get the same brake ride skill, better numbers, and the imaginary gift. The only positive to really playing old IZD is the fact that your brake ride locks don't cost anything. Here's a sample deck list I came up with. It centers around using Burium as much as possible to re-ride during the end phase and generate multiple force markers with V Nebula Nor Dragon as a way to enable locks. Do note that Burium doesn't actually need you to be on Infinite Vanguard in order to re-ride. And here's a little bit more of a refined list that my friend built while he was testing my build. When it comes to a lot of these fighter collection archetypes, they end up being more of an homage to the original cards than straight improvements. It is more of a way to remind these players that these units existed, rather than make it a playable deck. So what's the final verdict? Well, despite having barely any support, the deck has a fair amount of options. It's fairly competent at doing what it wants to do, and it benefits from also being part of the Starvader archetype. Link Joker in general is a deck that has a decently high skill ceiling to play these days, and if you choose to build an Infinite deck, you're willingly playing a worse Starvader deck. Whereas Chaos has a wide variety of support, Infinite has barely any and is relying on a small stock of old mechanics to make it go.